Welcome to some very famous people you've never really heard of. Bite-sized biographies of the famous, the infamous, and the quirky in less than an hour. My name is Philip D. Gibbons, and there is more information about me, this podcast, and a bibliography at bitesizebiographies.com. There are also photographs of many of the individuals and items mentioned in this podcast. At the conclusion of part one of this presentation, there will be additional suggestions concerning further information about today's subject, Senator Edward M. Kennedy and the bridge at Chappaquiddick. Now let's get started with our story about the bridge at Chappaquiddick and Senator Edward M. Kennedy. Martha's Vineyard is an island that lies approximately 10 miles off of the coast of southeastern Cape Cod, Massachusetts. In the 21st century, it joined such northeastern locations as the Hamptons, Bar Harbor, and even the Vineyard's sister island 30 miles to the east, Nantucket, as a chic and upscale destination for celebrities and the super rich. Most visitors arrive by a ferry that docks at the town of Vineyard Haven. Other hamlets dot the wooded and aquatic terrain, including Oak Bluffs, Aquina, formerly Gayhead, and the largest town on the southeastern side of the island, Edgartown. A narrow channel separates Edgartown from the external eastern tip of Martha's Vineyard, a portion of land known as Chappaquiddick Island. The development of the entire region has not spared Chappaquiddick, despite the fact that its only public access is via a ferry that can now hold 3 cars at a time, forcing passengers to wait for hours, especially in the summer high season, to cross, and virtually zero commercial development. Numerous large luxury homes dot the horizon, further evidence of the wealth and prestige that currently predominates. But for a certain generation of Americans, Chappaquiddick is known not as an upper-crust summer destination, but the site of one of the most notorious incidents in U.S. political history, a scandal that permanently altered the life and career of Senator Edward Kennedy and changed the American people's perception of the Kennedy family itself, previously practically worshipped as valiant demi-royalty. This incident officially began at 8:20 a.m. on July 19, 1969, when a call was received by a policewoman manning the switchboard at Edgartown's small police station. 2 fishermen, situated on a bridge on the eastern portion of Chappaquiddick Island that traversed one of the island's inlets, had noticed a car that was submerged upside down, apparently after driving over the side and landing in the water. The police chief, named Dominic Jim Arena, was informed, and he immediately set out for the location, a span known locally as Dyke Bridge. He would have to first drive his squad car onto the ferry to get from the Edgartown side onto the island itself, a distance of about 150 yards. Arena previously spent 13 years as a Massachusetts state trooper, subsequently working in the office of the Massachusetts Attorney General briefly before, in 1967, landing the job as Edgartown's police chief. Aside from the occasional drunken, disorderly tourist or car accident, the town and region was anything but a hotbed of criminal activity and police investigation. Although the weekend was especially crowded for the Edgartown Yacht Club's race weekend regatta, the previous night was a typical summer Friday evening with no major incidents. But as Jim Arena got out of his police cruiser in the vicinity of the Dyke Bridge, its top emergency lights spinning, he already sensed that he was about to embark on an unusual investigation. The bridge was a narrow wooden structure that traversed Poocha Pond, an inlet separating a thin strip of sandy beach, the easternmost portion of the island, from the rest of Chappaquiddick. Although it had no guardrails of any kind, it did have raised edges, and in the 20 years of its existence, no one had ever driven off of it. Directed by the 2 fishermen, who had first reported the submerged auto to the resident of the nearest house, who then phoned the island's emergency number, Arena was able to observe the vehicle, still submerged. It It was a large sedan, tilted in the water, its engine having weighed down the car's front portion so that the rear of the car was tilted upward, and the car was resting on its hood and windshield. As he noted brake marks and scrapes on the bridge, most likely caused by the car in the water, Arena also became aware of a woman walking towards him. Underlining the small number of even summer residents on Chappaquiddick, Arena immediately recognized her as Sylvia Mom, the seasonal renter of the home closest to the bridge, a small cottage known as Dyke House, the last house on Dyke Road, the road that led to the wooden span. In fact, in 1969, population was so sparse that in the off-season there were only 12 full-time residents. Arena, already concerned that someone might still be trapped in the car, asked Ms. Mom if she knew how long the car had been in the water. She replied that she didn't, but both her and her daughter heard a car go by their cottage at about midnight, indicating that the accident most likely occurred before daylight. Arena realized he would have to jump in the water, and after borrowing and donning a pair of Mom's husband's swim trunks, he ambled back to the bridge, radioed in a request for more police backup and the Edgartown Volunteer Fire Department's scuba diver, and attempted to at least observe what was in the interior of the car. Several times, Arena, a strong swimmer, tried to gain access to the vehicle, but the outgoing tide's strong current made even getting a hold of any part of the car a strenuous, taxing process. After borrowing a diving mask from one of the local residents who were now milling about the vicinity of the bridge, Arena could do little more than get a better look at the automobile. It looked compressed, and even if the windows had been normal-sized, the police chief now sensed that the current was too strong for him to safely access the submerged vehicle. As the depth of the inlet subsided, he was able to situate himself on the undercarriage of the car, intent on waiting for better-equipped personnel. It was only 8:45 a.m. when another policeman and 4 members of the volunteer fire department, including the fire chief, made it to the bridge and spilled out of the chief's station wagon. Included in this group was a volunteer fire department captain and search and rescue scuba diving expert, 33-year-old John Farrar. Farrar's efforts in the next few minutes would demonstrate his expertise, but in the meantime, Arena was intent on identifying the owner of the automobile. Able to now read the car's license plate, Arena yelled the letters and numbers to Patrolman Robert Bob Brugiere. L78207. Brugiere transmitted this information by radio to the state police barracks on the island, and after someone there consulted the state's auto registry, the registrant was identified as Edward M. Kennedy, room 2400, JFK Building, Government Center, Boston, Massachusetts. Upon hearing this information, a sense of urgency gripped especially Farrar, who, now understanding the possibility that someone as prominent as Senator Edward Kennedy might either be dead or desperately in need of help, quickly finished donning his equipment, including scuba tank, mask, and flippers, and swam to the vicinity of the car. Handing the end of a rope to Arena, he then dove down and accessed the vehicle, which had not only completely flipped over, but in doing so had also spun so that it was facing in the exact opposite direction of where it was previously headed on the bridge. Although the current was exerting the same force on Farrar, better equipped and a skillful, experienced diver, he was able to grab the vehicle and determine that the front driver's window was rolled down, allowing him to quickly stick his head inside and observe that the front seat was empty. The rear window on the driver's side was rolled up, but as Farrar inched by and looked closer, he was able to unmistakably see 2 feet, close together, still wearing sandals. Farrar immediately understood that someone was definitely in the vehicle and also surmised that they were probably dead. He quickly was able to swim around the rear of the car and observed that the 2 windows on the passenger side were shattered, with only a small amount of fragmented glass still attached to their frames. Peering inside the rear of the 2 windows, he saw what he presumed to be the body of a young woman in an upside-down seated position, her head situated in the normal foot space of the vehicle, her midriff draped on the back seat, and her feet up against the rear window. Farrar poked the closest extremity, the woman's thigh, its hardened state confirming that the individual was dead, rigor mortis already extant. He also noticed that the woman's hands were firmly gripping the front of the seat in front of her, and her head was leaning back awkwardly, Farrar thinking that she might have been attempting to access the last bubble of air accessible in the pitch-black sunken vehicle. He began the process of slowly extricating the body from the car, noticing that the victim was a young blonde, her long hair splayed out in the water, her eyes wide open with a disconcerting stare. Farrar eventually extricated the dead female and, wanting to prevent the current from sweeping her from his grasp, tied several loops with his rope around the deceased's neck. He then began to push the body to the surface. By now, the presence of several emergency vehicles with flashing lights had attracted even more of a crowd of residents. Still perched on the car, Irina gradually saw the body floating to the surface, a well-dressed, obviously young female. He wondered if it might be a member of the Kennedy family, and when Farrar surfaced, Irina asked him if he recognized her. Farrar said no and quickly dove back towards the car, eventually retrieving a gold chain and a purse. The chain had come off of the body's waist as it ascended, and the purse was resting on the interior roof of the overturned vehicle. The firemen on shore propelled a small boat towards the wreckage, and Farrar and Irina, who was cradling the body in his arms, gently placed it, chain and purse, in the craft, and had the fire crew pull it back to the shore by an attached rope. As quickly as possible, the body was placed on a stretcher, covered with a sheet, and deposited on the back seat of the police car. Irina and Farrar quickly came ashore, and the police chief picked up the fashionably designed purse and opened it. It contained mostly mundane items, with the exception of 2 motel room keys to the nearby Katama Shores Motor Inn and 2 pieces of identification of a woman named Rosemary Keogh. Irina concluded that this was the victim removed from the automobile. Initially shaken by his proximity to the aftermath of such a tragic accident, Irina quickly snapped out of it and began to delegate tasks to appropriate individuals. The Edgartown Grapevine was already transmitting news of the incident, and a small crowd, many town employees, was gathering at the bridge. Irina told Farrar that it might be possible that other victims might have been thrown from the vehicle and might be in the vicinity. He requested that the scuba diver take a thorough underwater look. Foster Silva, one of the few full-time local residents of the island and a watchman for the various island properties of part-time residents, as well as a member of the volunteer fire department himself, was asked to scour the shoreline for anything or anybody that might have washed up on the pond's exterior. Irina himself contacted the state police and asked them to call the motel to find out if Rosemary Keogh was actually a guest. Within minutes, he got word back that Keogh was not only registered, she was one of 6 women who were staying at the motel, although none returned on Friday night. To Irina, this was also disconcerting. Had foul play involved more than just this one drowning victim? A wrecker now also arrived, and Irina conversed with the driver, John Album, telling him that it was Ted Kennedy's car in the pond, and a dead girl was removed from it only a few minutes earlier. Alba mentioned that he had seen Ted Kennedy with a pair of other men at the ferry house on the Chappaquiddick side of the shore. Although Irina would not have been surprised at Kennedy's presence in the area on the weekend of the Edgartown Regatta, which the senator's family famously participated in annually, he was dismayed that the senator, assuming that he must have known that his car was missing, was in the vicinity and had not reported anything officially about a serious accident involving a fatality. Wondering if Kennedy was still completely unaware of the incident, he resolved to locate the senator in an attempt to clarify exactly what was going on. Heading back to Dyke House, he once again borrowed the phone and called into his dispatcher, policewoman Carmen Salvador, the chief intent on getting someone down to the ferry slip in an attempt to find Senator Kennedy. When Salvador picked up, he explained what he needed and got another surprise when the dispatcher told him that Kennedy was now inside the police station and was requesting to speak to the chief. Salvador then put the senator on the phone. Arena was hoping his conversation would clarify the situation. Instead, it became even more concerning. The chief explained briefly that an accident had occurred. A girl was found dead in the senator's car, and before he could continue, Kennedy cut him off, explaining that he knew about the accident. Arena then asked if perhaps there was anybody else in the car, Kennedy explaining that there was, but quickly requesting that he meet with Arena at the police station as soon as possible. Arena agreed, hung up the phone, and went back to the vicinity of the bridge. Intent on getting to the ferry slip ASAP, he did not want to take his cruiser with the body still on a stretcher in the back seat and the medical examiner and other officials still on the way. Instead, he bummed a ride from a seasonal resident who agreed to run him back to the ferry. Before he left, another familiar face appeared, that of Dukes County Deputy Sheriff and Chappaquiddick resident Christopher Huck Look, who was also pulling up in his own car. Asking what happened, Look was told by Arena that a car had gone off of the bridge and the owner was waiting for the chief at the station. Arena told Look to stick around, keep traffic orderly, and the situation under control. Before Arena left, Look blurted out that he had observed a car late the previous night and hoped it wasn't the same car. For the moment, Jim Arena ignored the remark, and within minutes, the chief was walking up the steps of the Edgartown police station. Although quite familiar with political celebrities as an experienced state trooper, Arena was already somewhat flummoxed by the confusion of the morning, and his attire certainly didn't help. He was about to interact with one of the most prominent politicians in the United States, clad in a soaking wet bathing suit and little else. Carmen Salvador's desk was situated close to the front door, and when Arena entered, without a word, she gestured towards the entrance to the chief's office. Arena opened the door and observed Ted Kennedy on the phone, seated at the chief's desk, and another individual who Arena immediately recognized as former U.S. Attorney Paul Markham sitting across the room. Kennedy quickly hung up the phone as the chief introduced himself, and the two shook hands, Markham leaving to allow the two to speak in private. Arena offered his condolences over the accident as if it was caused by someone else. But Kennedy responded with his biggest surprise of the morning yet, stating that he knew all about it because he was the driver. For the entire morning, Arena had not even considered that Edward Kennedy knew much about the accident's circumstances, much less that he was an actual participant. Even while still standing in front of his own desk in a soaking wet bathing suit, Arena understood that no matter how surreal, this whole incident now involved a new and unexpected revelation that was potentially criminal and politically explosive. But how unexpected was such an episode really? Anyone with an intimate knowledge of Ted Kennedy, his childhood and adult development, and role within the patriarchal Kennedy political dynasty might not have been surprised at all by the senator's current predicament. In fact, they might have shrugged off such an incident as utterly predictable. Born on February 22, 1932, Edward Moore Kennedy was the last of Joseph P. and Rose Kennedy's 9 children, but most importantly, the youngest of 4 boys. Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. was quite adamant that he intended to use his fortune and influence to elect one of his sons to the U.S. presidency, an obsession developed as a result of his rejection by the Boston Brahmin Protestant elite. Initially, typically, his eldest son, Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., was groomed for this responsibility. But after foregoing his last year in Harvard Law School to join the Navy, Kennedy Jr. was killed in a World War II aviation mishap in which his bomber, a specially converted drone B-24 Liberator packed with explosives, detonated prematurely, killing Kennedy Jr. and his co-pilot instantly. John F. Kennedy would then be tapped to follow the path of his deceased older brother, graduating from Harvard, successful elections, first to the House of Representatives, the U.S. Senate, and ultimately the presidency. This remarkable political run ended tragically with the president's assassination in 1963, an act that catapulted the Kennedy family into an unprecedented American status that bordered on a cult of personality. Robert Kennedy quickly became the family's standard-bearer, and while much more abrasive and disliked by many of his political peers, Bobby eventually seemed poised for a successful presidential campaign before his assassination in June of 1968. Publicly, at the time, Ted Kennedy stated, "Like my three brothers before me, I pick up a fallen standard. Sustained by the memory of our priceless years together, I shall try to carry forward that special commitment to justice, to excellence, to courage that distinguished their lives." But Ted Kennedy was quite different than his three brothers. Junior to his oldest siblings, who were well into their teens when he was born, Ted was always looked upon as the baby of the family. A famous childhood anecdote has the eldest Kennedy boys delivering to a paper route on bicycle, and Ted handling the same chore chauffeured in the family limousine. Because he was the youngest male child growing up, Ted Kennedy did not receive the same compulsive competitiveness that Joe Sr. inflicted on his older sons, and expectations were not as high as his other brothers went off to Harvard. Eventually, Ted did too, and this is where some personality dysfunction first began to manifest itself. Kennedy graduated 36th out of a class of 56 at Milton Academy. Although a standout athlete who played both offense and defense on the Harvard freshman football team, Kennedy's grades were mediocre, and by the second semester he was struggling in Spanish and on the verge of possibly failing the class, a development that would have affected his athletic eligibility. His solution was to pay a classmate to take an exam for him. The ruse was uncovered, and both students were kicked out of school, although typically such students were eventually readmitted upon reapplication. Kennedy was so ashamed by the incident and his father's anger that he enlisted in the U.S. Army, also signing up for a 4-year hitch, most likely by mistake. Although angry, Joe Kennedy did not want his son wasting 4 years of his life in the military, and pulling strings, he made sure that Ted not only had to serve only 2 years, but also was stationed in Europe, avoiding the Korean conflict. He wound up in an honor guard, stationed in Paris, a relatively cushy assignment, and he was honorably discharged as a private first class. He returned to Harvard, where he continued to receive average grades and play football, lettering in his senior year and scoring the team's only touchdown in the 1955 Harvard-Yale game. By now, Ted was at least motivated by his older brother's presence in the U.S. Senate after John F. Kennedy's Senate victory in 1952. Ted Kennedy was rejected by Harvard Law School and instead attended the University of Virginia. While there, he continued to be a mediocre student, but also racked up a series of troubling interactions involving the local police, speeding, and reckless driving. Observed several times by the same policeman, the most egregious Kennedy offense occurred when this traffic cop spotted Ted in his car zipping through a red light at 90 miles per hour and then shutting off his lights to attempt to prevent anyone from following him. This time the policeman successfully trailed him, and after a few lefts and rights, the cop located the automobile, seemingly empty, parked in a driveway. Getting a closer look at the car, the officer noticed someone stretched out in the front seat, attempting to hide. It was Ted Kennedy, who promptly received citations for reckless driving, avoiding arrest, and driving without a license. This was a far cry from the gallant valor of his doomed but courageous brother Joe, or the PT-109 heroics of his brother Jack. Once again, Joe Sr. got some crack attorney involved, and Ted merely had to pay a modest fine. But in all, he would be stopped and cited for some form of driving infraction on 5 occasions during his tenure at UVA Law. It cemented his reputation within the family as an immature bungler, unlike his polished, sophisticated, and successful brothers. Nevertheless, he successfully graduated from UVA in 1959, having already served as Jack Kennedy's Senate re-election campaign chairman in 1958. Kennedy also married Joan Bennett in the same year, the couple moving to Boston. Whether it was some intercession on the part of one of his attorneys or merely a bureaucratic omission, Kennedy's record of serious Virginia driving infractions would not be recorded by the Massachusetts Department of Motor Vehicles upon his arrival back in the state, a development that ultimately greatly benefited Ted Kennedy during the legal process subsequent to the Chappaquiddick accident. The election of John F. Kennedy to the presidency presented Ted Kennedy with a political opportunity that no other American citizen could have even dreamed of. Appointed in 1961 to what was a veritable sinecure as an assistant DA at the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office, predictably Kennedy only showed up a few times a week and tried very few cases, completely unprepared whenever this rarity occurred. It was clear that he was treading water until he eventually determined which political office he would seek. Although a political career for Ted Kennedy was inevitable, subsequent events underlined an audacious political ambition that was breathtaking even for the now vaunted Kennedy machine. JFK's inauguration left a vacancy of his Senate seat that would have to be filled by appointment until the general election in November of 1962. Even if President Kennedy wanted to appoint his brother Ted, he couldn't, as Ted was still too young, not yet 30. But he would be by November of 1962, and President Kennedy himself made it clear that he wished that a political unknown, one Benjamin A. Smith II, the mayor of Gloucester, Mass., be appointed to the seat in the meantime. Smith had one fundamental qualification for the position. He was Joe Kennedy Jr.'s former Harvard roommate with no political ambition of his own, and his selection would prevent the ascension of various other high-profile Massachusetts politicians intent on the appointment as a springboard to election. Although JFK was dismayed by the optics of having both his brother Bobby as Attorney General in his cabinet and Ted hand-picked as a potential senator, Joe Kennedy Sr., still quite vigorous prior to an eventually debilitating 1961 stroke, was insistent. It was in 1962 that Ted Kennedy faced his first and most difficult and vitriolic campaign of his political career. While the Kennedy family was riding high nationally, a different Massachusetts Democratic political faction was not comfortable with a literally underaged, completely inexperienced neophyte gaining access to a U.S. Senate seat. Edward T. McCormick, the state attorney general, was a literal family member and nephew of another Massachusetts political dynasty headed by the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, John McCormick. Unlike the patrician Kennedys, Ed McCormick was a product of rough-and-tumble Boston political infighting, and he and others were put off by what they considered to be Ted Kennedy's arrogance in assuming that his mere family name entitled him to a seat in the U.S. Senate. His campaign decided to make this the focal point of a 1962 primary campaign that would select the Democratic Senate candidate in November. The revelation that Ted was kicked out of Harvard was revealed by the Boston Globe, despite attempts by the White House to squelch the story. The McCormick campaign also utilized the slogan, "Teddy is not ready," words that infuriated Ted Kennedy and led to a lifelong aversion to the nickname Teddy. Understanding that he was trailing in the polls, McCormick went astonishingly negative in a televised debate when he pointedly remarked, "I ask you if his name was Edward Moore, with your qualifications. Teddy, if it was Edward Moore, your candidacy would be a joke. Nobody's laughing because his name is not Edward Moore. It is Edward Moore Kennedy." It made zero difference and probably backfired, despite Ted Kennedy's poor speaking style and lack of any professional or political competence. His good looks, boyish demeanor, and most of all his connection to his famous brother carried him to a 69% victory. In November, he easily won election to a Senate seat he would hold for the next 47 years. Edward Kennedy would have little time to enjoy the political achievements of his remarkable family. President Kennedy was assassinated a year later. In 1964, Ted Kennedy was involved in a small aircraft crash that killed two others, broke his back, and landed him in the hospital just as the election campaign for a full 6-year term began. Bedridden for months, his family, and especially his wife Joan, campaigned on his behalf, and riding a wave of sympathy over his serious injury, JFK's assassination, and the LBJ landslide, Ted was reelected with a 1.1 million vote plurality. Although Ted Kennedy was able to work with his brother Robert, this also came to an abrupt and shocking end with Robert F. Kennedy's assassination in June of 1968, while the senator was running for president. Ted Kennedy publicly rejected a last-minute attempt to draft him as the 1968 Democratic presidential candidate at the fractured Chicago Party Convention, understanding that this effort was based more on emotion and grief instead of sound political judgment. He wisely decided to wait to burnish his image as a senator, which he did by, in January of 1969, winning election as Senate Majority Whip, the third most powerful position in Senate Democratic leadership. But insiders noted that in early 1969, Kennedy had difficulty focusing on his senatorial duties and also seemed to be drinking heavily. He was still deeply affected by the death of his brother Bobby based on their similar ages growing up. He was much closer emotionally to him than his brother Jack. Ted Kennedy must have looked forward to the week of July 13, 1969, some rest and relaxation far away from the Capitol, sailing and good cheer with old friends and acquaintances. He would sail as he had many times in the annual Edgartown Regatta, his only concern the weather. Promptly at 3 p.m. on Friday, July 18, 1969, he began sailing in the Wiano Senior Competition with 30 other participants, the almost 12-mile course starting near Edgartown and proceeding out into Nantucket Sound and back. Kennedy was at the controls of the Victoria, a boat he inherited from JFK. The Victoria did not go unobserved. 6 women in a chartered fishing boat were eagerly following Senator Kennedy's progress in the race. These were the female ex-members of the Boiler Room Girls, former staff for the ill-fated Robert Kennedy presidential campaign. Their presence was the result of a previous get-together in the summer of 1968, when their boss, another Kennedy family member and close confidant of Ted Kennedy, Joseph Gargan, organized a Nantucket outing to reward this hard-working group, hoping to take their minds off of the tragedy that ended RFK's campaign and life. A well-attended success, Gargan suggested to Ted Kennedy, who had not participated, that the Edgartown Regatta would be an appropriate place to stage a similar reunion in the summer of 1969. Ted Kennedy agreed that this would be a great idea and delegated organization of the event to his cousin Gargan, a not atypical designation. Gargan and Kennedy had a strong connection that dated back to Ted Kennedy's childhood. Gargan was the son of Rose Kennedy's younger sister, who died when Joe Gargan was 6. Several years later, the Kennedy family invited Joe, who lived in gritty Lowell, Massachusetts, to summer in Hyannisport. Gargan was 2 years older than Ted, much more athletic and worldly than the chubby, sheltered Kennedy child. Unlike Ted, who was practically helpless, Gargan could change a flattened tire or repair a household appliance, an attitude that endeared him to the Kennedy clan, so much so that he repeatedly spent entire summers at the Kennedy compound. Joe Gargan developed a very close bond with his much more high-profile cousin, a relationship that lasted into adulthood. Gargan worked as an advance man on all of the Kennedy campaigns, starting with Jack, and he got a reputation as someone who was streetwise and industrious, a problem solver who ultimately earned the nickname Joey'll Fix-It. But unlike many accounts which depicted Gargan as little more than an orphan and glorified gopher, the Kennedy cousin actually came from a family with its own strong identity. Gargan's father played football at Notre Dame with Newt Rockne. Unlike Joseph Kennedy Sr., he was a frequently decorated U.S. Marine officer who served in combat, was wounded in World War I, and discharged as a captain. Post-war, he worked in Army intelligence in the Philippines, served in the cabinet of Franklin D. Roosevelt during World War II, and was working as a lobbyist for fledgling Pan American World Airways when he died of a sudden heart attack in 1946. His son did not idolize the Kennedys in any way. In fact, he enjoyed explaining that when Joe Kennedy Sr. needed tickets to the Army Notre Dame game, he had to ask Joe Gargan Sr. It was Gargan Jr. that made the arrangements for the regatta weekend. Early on, he made the fateful decision to rent the cottage on Chappaquiddick. Everything on the water in Edgartown was already taken, and the island spot was one of the few that allowed the lessee to stay through Sunday, the 20th of July. The plan was for every attendee to stay at various motels on the Edgartown side and for all of the guests to show up at a cookout at the Chappaquiddick cottage known locally as the Lawrence Cottage, owned by a Scarsdale, New York attorney named Sidney Lawrence. The dwelling was too small for all of the partygoers to stay there, with only a kitchen and living rooms, 2 small bedrooms, and a bathroom. The 6 boiler room girls, all former Kennedy campaign workers, were Esther Newberg, Rosemary Cricket Keogh, Susan Tannenbaum, Mary Jo Kopechne, and sisters Nancy Lyons and Mary Ellen Lyons. The men attending the party included Joe Gargan, former U.S. Attorney Paul Markham, Kennedy's chauffeur and personal assistant Jack Crimmins, Charlie Tretter, Ray LaRosa, both longtime Kennedy campaign workers, and Senator Kennedy himself. All of the women were single and in their 20s. All of the men, save Crimmins, were married. Although Joan Kennedy was pregnant, the reason later given for her not being present, all of the wives of any prospective attendees were discouraged from coming. An atmosphere that diminished the turnout from the previous year. While the participants later denied any disreputable intent that could be inferred from this guest list, the optics, especially for Senator Kennedy, subsequently certainly raised eyebrows. Before the regatta, the 6 women and Ted Kennedy went swimming early Friday afternoon. Kennedy was picked up at Martha's Vineyard Airport by Crimmins in an Oldsmobile Delmont 88 sedan, ferried over to Chappaquiddick where he changed clothes and was then driven across Dyke Bridge to East Beach, the narrow strip of land on the easternmost side of the island. The entire group then headed back to Edgartown in time for the afternoon yacht race in which the Victoria finished 9th. Senator Kennedy then boarded the winning sailboat for an impromptu cocktail party and then, at about 6 o'clock, checked into his quarters for the weekend, the Shiretown Inn. Gargan returned to the Shiretown in time for a few beers with the senator before Crimmins again brought Kennedy back to the Chappaquiddick cottage, which was empty. The boiler room girls had gone back to their motel before LaRosa took them to the ferry. Gargan was waiting for all of them on the other side in his own rented auto, a white Plymouth Valiant. The party, as it were, starting a little after 7:30. Gargan was already disappointed by the small turnout, and with an upset stomach, he stuck to Coca-Cola for the entire evening. As the host, he was also responsible for the food, a small uncooperative charcoal grill holding up steak dinners until about 9:45. Complaints about the tape cassette music prompted Charlie Tretter, accompanied by Cricket Keogh, to go back to Edgartown to retrieve a transistor radio. They used the Oldsmobile and were back around 10 o'clock, Keogh apparently leaving her pocketbook in the car. Although some of this information and subsequent events became public during the course of court proceedings, it was almost 20 years before any real specifics concerning the behavior of the key players in the Chappaquiddick incident were revealed. This occurred with the publication of a 1988 book entitled Senatorial Privilege, written by Leo DeMore. DeMore, unlike any other journalist, was able to get at least one major participant in the Chappaquiddick incident to discuss what happened. That individual was Joseph Gargan. Gargan's most insightful information concerned the moments leading up to the accident involving Mary Jo Kopechne and the subsequent events early in the morning of Saturday, July 19th. While the younger partygoers were boisterous and singing, the men, including Gargan and Crimmins, a notorious grouch, especially after a few drinks, were already looking forward to the party winding down. Crimmins and Senator Kennedy had a standard routine in which Kennedy would kid the chauffeur about being too drunk to drive, and Crimmins would actually tell him to take a cab. Gargan also recalled Crimmins loudly mentioning that the last ferry was at midnight, and he was tired and wanted everybody to leave so he could get some sleep. This possibly prompted various attendees to take a walk in the neighborhood. the weather hot and muggy, especially in the cramped cottage. At some point, Senator Kennedy asked Jack Crimmins for the keys to the Oldsmobile. Kennedy stated that this was about 11:15 and that he was intent on catching a ferry before midnight and returning to the Shiretown Inn. Gargan could not recall the exact time, but he does remember observing Kennedy leaving with one of the females attending the party, Mary Jo Chappaquiddick. Kennedy would state later that Mary Jo was also tired and wanted to get back to her motel room, and he, Kennedy, offered to give her a lift. However, her purse would subsequently be discovered left behind at the cottage. Unfortunately for Crimmins, the rest of the group either ignored or were unaware that shortly thereafter it was midnight and the ferry was shut down for the evening. Although officially most of the attendees would claim that there was not a lot of heavy drinking transpiring, Gargan and the amount of liquor present indicated otherwise. It was subsequently determined that 3.5 gallons of vodka, 4/5 of scotch, 2 bottles of rum, and 2 cases of beer were purchased for the cookout. Gargan later stated, "Some people at the party had had quite a few, no question. Everybody's a little bombed except Ray LaRosa. LaRosa did not drink." Foster Silva, the aforementioned full-time island caretaker, lived only 100 yards from the Lawrence cottage. He was aware of the party at 10 p.m., the noise of music and voices clearly audibly loud. By midnight, he was irritated when he tried to go to sleep, and the noise continued at the same level. It was 1:30 a.m. by the time Silva, by now angry enough to consider calling the police, sensed that the revelers were simmering down. Perhaps coincidentally, at some time between midnight and 1:30, Ray LaRosa came into the kitchen and buttonholed Gargan, quietly telling him that the senator was outside and needed to see him. Gargan found the senator in the back seat of the Valiant and got in, but before he said much of anything, Kennedy requested that Markham join them. When both men were settled in the front seat, the senator said, "There's been a terrible accident. The car's gone off the bridge down by the beach, and Mary Jo is in it." Once Gargan heard the basics, he immediately responded, heading down to the beach at a rapid clip. He slowed down to cross the bridge, and Kennedy gestured to the right, telling them that the car was there. When Gargan observed that instead of the car sticking out of the water right side up, it was flipped over and completely submerged, he had a sense of dread immediately that whoever was in that car was already beyond rescue. It easily took 45 minutes to an hour for Senator Kennedy to walk back to the cottage, extricate Markham and Gargan, and get back to the beach. It was highly unlikely that anyone trapped inside was still alive, but both Gargan and Markham resolved to give it their best shot. Gargan maneuvered the car off the bridge onto the beach side to shine his lights on the water. Both men at Gargan's behest stripped off all of their clothes, Gargan telling Markham that they didn't want any clothing getting impaled on the wreckage and trapping them underwater as well. Markham had hurt his leg while sailing and had consumed much more alcohol than Gargan, so it was Gargan who attempted to physically gain access to the car. His first obstacle was a tremendous tidal current that was so strong that whenever he attempted to get close to the car, the water would push him away with a force that didn't even allow him to keep his eyes open. Pitch black underwater in any case, his only ability to access the car was by touch, attempting to hold on to the car's undercarriage and feeling with his feet for a door handle or open window. Several times he submerged but got nowhere, Markham having to grab him before he was swept away. He then swam around to the front of the car and had more success, at one point actually able to access the interior of the vehicle, erratically reaching around blindly hoping to feel something. He quickly lost his breath and even started to panic, almost getting stuck in the car himself. Gargan was 25 yards from the car before Markham swam and retrieved him. As they both swam back toward the vehicle, Gargan could see and hear Ted Kennedy illuminated in the Valiant's headlights. After each time Gargan resurfaced, the senator yelled over, asking if they could see anything or if she was still in the car. Now, apparently realizing that nothing could be done, he was on his back, hands behind his head, knees pulled up in a practically fetal position, occasionally loudly repeating the same phrase over and over. "Oh my God, what am I going to do?" Gargan decided on one last-ditch attempt, diving directly down and successfully grabbing onto a door handle. It didn't open despite Gargan's ability to unlock it. He pressed again and again, pushing his foot against the side of the car to get some leverage. It didn't work. He surfaced and told Markham the current was too tough and there was nothing else they could do. As they got out of the water and headed over to the Valiant, Ted Kennedy was already there, now saying repeatedly, "I can't believe that this happened." Finally exasperated, Gargan blurted out, "What did happen?" Kennedy claimed that he was driving down Dyke Road and unexpectedly he was suddenly on the bridge, the car going over the side. It rapidly filled up with water and he thought he would drown, but somehow he floated to the surface. He claimed to have repeatedly tried to swim to the car and rescue Mary Jo, but finally decided it would be better to get help. Again, Kennedy asked out loud, but almost to himself, "What am I going to do?" Gargan told him there was nothing he could do, meaning that any rescue was now impossible. Kennedy then asked to be taken to Edgartown. Markham and Gargan put their clothes back on and headed in the direction of the ferry. Once again in the car, Kennedy started to again repeat, "Do you believe it, Joe? Can you believe this happened?" Gargan was repeating that, "We've got to report this immediately. We've got to get a hold of the police." Markham didn't say much, but he also didn't contradict Gargan. Kennedy was quiet for a few moments and then suggested that they report an alternative account of what happened, that Mary Jo had dropped him off and then confused made a wrong turn and had gone off of the bridge. They could all go back to the cottage, let people see the senator. He could then leave, and then Joe could subsequently find the submerged car and report it to police. Gargan immediately shot the entire idea down, raising some quibbles, but ultimately focusing on one fundamental. Senator Kennedy had told him that he was driving the car. They would have to file a false police report that would involve all three of them attorneys concocting a story that could certainly get Gargan and Markham disbarred, especially if they were observed on the bridge loudly shouting to each other well before any subsequent report to the police. Gargan kept insisting that they needed to contact the police as soon as possible. Ted Kennedy remained silent as they pulled up to the ferry slip. According to Gargan, after an additional demand that they needed to get the police involved, Kennedy snapped, "All right, I'll take care of it. I'm tired of listening to you. Go back to the cottage and don't say anything to get the girls involved or upset them." And without another word, he quickly advanced to the narrow channel separating Chappaquiddick from Edgartown and dove in, intent on swimming across, the ferry long since closed down. Gargan was not only shocked, he also became furious. Other than a curt, "I'll take care of it," there really hadn't been an acknowledgement that Kennedy would report the accident. He watched as the senator receded in the distance, seemingly able to make it across with little difficulty. Gargan and Markham then started to head back to the cottage, but halfway there, Gargan had second thoughts and decided to head back to the ferry slip. Intent on swimming across himself, hoping to be supportive of the senator in doing the right thing and reporting the accident. But, upon reflection, Gargan decided against that and turned around and headed back to the cottage. He knew that keeping the party participants under control and uninvolved in the situation until Senator Kennedy reported the accident was critical. When Markham and Gargan got back to the cottage, it was 2:30 a.m., quiet, the party over, participants all over couches, floors, and in the bedrooms now attempting to sleep. To anyone who asked where he'd been, Gargan gave no specifics other than that Senator Kennedy swam back to Edgartown and Mary Jo was back at her motel. Gargan then lay down on the floor right by the living room screen door entrance, a position that would allow him to be aware of anyone entering the cottage. Markham had such trouble sleeping after having to share a couch that he eventually went out to the Valiant and plopped down on the rear seat. Like most of the cottage inhabitants, he was unable to get much rest, and by 5:30 a.m., many of the bleary-eyed partiers were stirring. The first ferry left at 7:30. Gargan, Markham, and Charlie Treader were on it. Cricket Keogh and Rosemary Tannenbaum asked to go as well, and Gargan included them, but upon landing at Edgartown, he and Markham quickly distanced themselves from the two women and said goodbye as they attempted to locate Ted Kennedy. Gargan already had a nagging feeling that nothing about the accident was reported. He realized that emergency workers and even police would have at least checked on the cottage if Senator Kennedy had discussed the circumstances of the accident with them. At the Shiretown Inn, Gargan quickly observed Senator Kennedy on the balcony near his room in a calm conversation with Ross Richards, the skipper of the boat that won the senator's yacht race the day before, Richards' wife Marilyn, and Stan Moore, another yachtsman. Gargan could tell immediately from the group's demeanor that no police report had been filed, and he was again immediately so angered that he barged up the stairway to the second-floor balcony and practically ordered Kennedy back to his room, telling Ted that he needed to talk to him. Richards invited Kennedy to breakfast, but the senator said that perhaps later might be better. Gargan, with Markham and Kennedy, entered the senator's room. The door shut soundly behind them. Gargan let Markham ask the obvious question of what happened, and did Kennedy notify the police as they agreed. Kennedy sat on one of the room's beds and calmly responded, "I didn't report it." Thank you for listening to part one of this podcast about Senator Edward M. Kennedy. Information for this podcast came from the books The Bridge at Chappaquiddick by Jack Olson and Senatorial Privilege by Leo DeMore. There are also additional photographs, bibliographical, and musical information at bitesizebiographies.com. If you have enjoyed this presentation, please like us at our Facebook page. And remember that bite-sized biographies are now available on Spotify. And of course, remember also to tell a friend about bite-sized biographies.